Do you believe that witchcraft or magic or sort of farmer folk magic was being practiced at the time or even recently?
I don't have any trouble believing it was practice. I don't have to believe it, but I think people believed in it. They were uneducated, especially John Bell's generation, and Kate Betts probably had little or no education. And I think, again, just like they did up in the East, the lack of education and the strange behavior of certain women in particular get them branded as a witch. Probably or may not have been anything. Some of them may have practiced something. We got people today that are trying to practice witchcraft. I have a classmate that says she is involved with it, and she's an educated woman, got a master's degree. It blew my mind when I learned about it. So yes, it was practiced. What I believe about it we could debate.
I'm curious, so Kate Betts, everyone believed it was Kate Betts' witch, but she was still living in town.
You know, I talked to, really that's not town, but she was closer to Adams Station. I've talked to a lot of the Bells and the older ones that have now died, and they did not dislike Kate particularly. The books set that out, and there may have been people back then that when they wrote the books they were really anti-Kate, but I talked to Bob Bell, who's still alive. His daddy ran the funeral home until he died a few years ago, and he said that he'd never heard about the family hating Kate and Frederick, but the book seems to indicate that.
I've been interested in Kate Betts and the whole idea of her being behind the haunting and the witchcraft for a minute, but when I spoke to a leading expert in town, he basically said that this was something that was perpetrated by authors and people who wanted to portray her as a bad person. And this is still done to this day, although apparently she was a very good friend of the Bell family. I'm going to be exploring at the beginning of this video a little bit of her family history in town. This is the Betts Cemetery, kind of just outside of town, and it was shown on bellwitch.org. It kind of took a little bit of effort to get in there because you have to go around the back way. It is no longer inhabited. The house here has been abandoned for years, but I did find that this is not her cemetery. She's buried on the other side of town near the Bell property.
They're buried in the upper corner.
Kate Betts is?
Her and her husband, that'd be Frederick. That's what I was told. Now, I never found the stone, but that's where we came when we shot the film for one of the TV shows. And I would take them up there and say, well, now this is where they're supposed to be, but I can't find them. Their old house was, I'll show you when we get up at the top of the hill, was back to the left, and you can still see the tree line that went back to it. See those big old trees? You'd go right up through the middle of those trees, and Kate and Frederick Betts' house was back there somewhere around that fence, a little fence. And of course the new house they built afterwards is back to the left there.
And this is the Bellwood Cemetery where a lot of the Bell family descendants are buried, and this marks kind of the central part of their property. As you look out through the main gate, if you look right, going along the main road through town, most of that on the right side of the road was, on the cemetery side, Bell's property. Bellwood Cemetery all the way down to the Bell Witch Fall Festival. But if you follow the road from Bellwood Cemetery in the top center, right down, directly across from Highway 41 North, is Kate Betts' old property. And that is also apparently where she's buried, and I heard some rumors that her grave is still there, but highly overgrown.
Well, that is the gate to Kate Betts' place. And if you zoom in over here, you have the Red River Baptist Church, established in 1791. Yeah, I think this was probably the one that she went to. She could have walked here every morning.
We dug Joel and his wife and his children up and moved them to Bellwood up here, which is right up there. And that's the top off of Joel's casket. I didn't want the dadgum thing, but Bob Bell did it, and he brought it in here and said, you're going to put it in there. And I said, okay. Yeah. So that's his actual false teeth for when he died in 1890.
Would it be possible for you to show us his grave? Because I wasn't able to find it when I was up there.
Well, it's not marked. I know where it is. He hasn't put the stones in. When he was on fire, he called me. I was at work. I come home from school and just dead tired. He said, Tim, you get up here right now. I said, Bob, I'm dead tired. I've been working all day fighting with them kids. And he said, you get up here and you bring your camera and come right now. And were just digging on Junior or Joel Egbert Sr. grave when I got there, and part of his skull was there,
Yeah.
and false teeth were there, and they moved it all up and took the stones up. They took them to the farm out there, the Bell farm, and they brought them down here and buried them in plastic bags, what was left of them.
Yeah.
But some of them had nothing more than a black spot. I
Oh,
mean, some of the kids that had died in the 1830s and
Yeah.
40s, there was nothing there but just a dark spot.
Yeah.
Joel Bell was the youngest child of John Bell Sr., whose death is attributed to the Bell Witch. He remembers very little of the haunting, but learned more later in life by talking to his mom and siblings. There are a few different legends tying Joel Bell and the witch years later. At some point, the original Bell home was torn down, and Joel used some of the remnants to build a new one overlooking the Red River. There were at least 2 sightings in this house of the Bell Witch. Firstly, in the summer of 1852, Dr. Henry Sugg claimed that he was visiting this home and witnessed his medicine vials shaking and rattling. At another point in 1861, a Confederate soldier who had been discharged to get over an illness was visited by a friend, another soldier, and both men claimed that they heard strange noises in the kitchen and from the woods around the cabin. Their dog became hysterical and fought an unseen force until the early hours of the morning. However, Joel, who was a successful farmer, was away for both of these incidents and wasn't able to confirm them with his own sight. He befriended Martin Ingram, who wrote the mostly fictitious authenticated history of the Bell Witch, drawing from some of his stories. Joel died in 1890 and was buried nearby, but his family has begun the process of exhuming their relatives from small, isolated cemeteries around their property and consolidating them at the Bellwood Cemetery along the old Highway 41.
There's 5 or 6 board members, I'm one of them, that oversee this. Of course, we keep it in immaculate shape. You can see that we redo everything in here. And now we have Joel Bell and his 13 or 12 or 13, 14 of his family members here. And they're buried right over here behind the tree, but we still don't have them marked. Now, Bob has got it marked on a map, but he still hadn't brought the stones down here from the farm. You might want to hold away from that little notch there. This part right in here where the granite is was built in 1957. And I asked Emerson Meggs, our funeral director, who was here at the time, I said, is that the way they were lined up in there? There's a bunch of bells in there, and there's other people too. And he said, no, son, the man that did that was wealthy. He was a Covington. And if they weren't in proper line, their stones are there anyway. There's one old stone in there from 1936, and it's one of John Bell's grandsons. But I had just gotten on the board. It's been 10 or 15 years ago. And I got a call one night, and I'm the only one that lives in Adams. The rest of the board members are scattered here, there, and yonder, Nashville, Springfield. And they said, Tim, you need to get over here. There's something happened. I said, what's going on? So you better come over here. And some dude had hit those front gates up there with his car and knocked them wide open and was going to hit that obelisk back there and kill himself. Well, he hit the wall, and it kind of knocked him off guard, and it sent him in the air, and he ended up on top of those stones. We had to replace 2 or 3. And he decided he wanted to live. And so he called somebody on his cell phone, and they came, and they were all over Adams looking for him because this was supposed to be locked up. They locked this thing at dark. And they finally went in here and found him sitting back there in the car on the stones, and I don't know what, he'd broke some legs or whatever, and they hauled him into the hospital, and I guess he's still alive, but they hit him up. We'll go left. Oh, let's go straight. That's what we'll do here.
Just a couple hundred yards south of the old John Bell Jr. homestead, we have the old Bell family cemetery, mostly descendants of John Bell Jr. Legends say that Jr. was in almost constant communication with the witch and engaged her in conversation, debate, challenges, and even listened to her prophesize after she returned in 1828 for a short time, although this 1828 return is still hotly debated. And it's said that he was the last person that she spoke to after she left in 1828. The grave that we're actually looking at right now, the empty one, is the grave of Mary Allen Bell Koch, and there's some legend surrounding this grave. It was kind of haunted and turned up in recent years, but I'll get to that in a minute. Basically, the story of John Bell Jr. is that, and this video, by the way, Tim Henson is talking, but the audio is totally clipped out. The wind was a bit too strong clipped out all the audio, but it said that he relayed all of his conversations to Joel Bell, and that he was the source for a lot of the legend, because this was a thing that was within the family until Joel Bell took it down, and Joel Bell gave this info to his son, Dr. Charles Bailey Bell, who published The Bell Witch, A Mysterious Spirit. And married next to Bell Jr. is Elizabeth Bell, who was the original wife of John Bell Jr., and together they built this house just south of the original John Bell Sr. property. This was the cabin which burned down in 1917. I'll go there in a minute. You can still see charred bricks all over the place. They had 6 kids and around 600 acres of land. And here Tim Henson is just pointing to a couple of other graves of the John Bell family. A lot of them don't have headstones because this legend is very important to people, and people will just steal the headstones, a lot of which are apparently haunted. And here we have Zadok Bell, who died in 1857. There's very little in existing legends, but Tim Henson says that he has written down in his book this Zadok Bell.
That's a nice little hill right there. And I don't know what he had, maybe a cistern for water. I think, if I read right, it burned down about 1917. Could have been an accident or on purpose, who knows.
The old house?
The old house of Junior's.
Are there any photos of it?
I can't prove it. Bob may have it and don't know it. Bob Bell has most of the old papers. I have a few. But I've never seen a house that I can strictly identify as Junior's house.
Well, this is Bell Jr.
Yeah, Bell Sr. lived in a field right over there, and that's where the original cemetery is for those kids. Stole his grave and one of them died in a car crash. But it's no longer marked, and the owners of the cave, back when it was open a few years ago, it hasn't been open for 2 years, but they used to do tours until they got caught, because the farmer that owns the field directly over this one, he's real picky about people being on his land. But so they kind of set up a fake cemetery right behind the cave, and people couldn't really tell the difference. But John Bell Jr. was also wrapped up in the legend, and his tombstone was stolen from that graveyard behind us now. And you can see some of the red bricks. Yeah. Well, the house wasn't haunted, but what the Bell Witch said, the people were haunted, and what the Bell Witch told them was that they had dug up one of those Indian burials, and there were Indian burials all over the place because the Red River's right there, and they would form along the rivers and leave little burial mounds. And they dug it up, and they found one of the boxes, or the limestone boxes, and they got a tooth and brought it back. And well, John Bell said, "Oh, that's very bad luck, put it back." And one of the guys kind of just stupidly threw the jawbone against the house, and a tooth fell under. And the Bell Witch said that that was what caused her to be there. And then she later said, "Nope, I've just always been here." So she would constantly send them on wild goose chases. But wow, a lot of the original structure here. It looks like it. It might be some extra stuff, but... And the guy said that one of the houses up here behind this trailer is one of the original either Bell's or Bat's houses.
Oh, and it's rock. And if you go to the right, where that corner's up there, there's some cedar trees in there. That's where he's buried in there. Now, they say his house was east, that'd be this way, of that well down there, somewhere up out of the swamp. I've seen that whole bottom where the well is underwater.
And that's
So
John Bell Sr.
I'm gonna bet that that well wasn't much fit to drink out of, even if it was still holding water. It would be contaminated. But people are either tougher or they went ahead and died. I don't know which. This was a tremendous old house here before this one. It went on back to the Bell days. And they built that one in 5. And then in 1940, the last 2 Johnston sisters sold. I've got a piece somewhere that announces the sale. 3rd John, if you see the big tree up this lane down here, there's a big tree or 2 in the middle back there. That was in front of 3rd John's house, which was still there when I was in high school. And I've got a couple pictures online here of it. probably in the early 70s before they tore it down. It looks rough. Some students came down here from IU and interviewed a bunch of old people and took pictures of that house, and it was still standing. Wish I'd had enough sense to do that.
Behind me now is Johnston Springs, and this is where the Bell girl actually broke up with Joshua Gardner on the insistence, apparently, of the Bell Witch, or Kate Batts' witch. And the John Bell Sr.'s property was just up the road about a mile, and I believe James Johnston had a house just over the ridge about a couple hundred yards up that way, and it burned down in 1951, but this is the spot where, according to legend, they broke up. Lucy Bell, I believe, and Joshua Gardner, and she got with a much, much older man who was a school teacher. But they say that the springs, there's a hole under it, and the water vanishes along, I think, Sturgis Creek, and the farmer put dye in it, and 2 hours later, up it comes at Bell Springs, which is a little ways away.
Joshua Gardner has an interesting side story as the more age-appropriate suitor and boyfriend of Betsy Bell. Although the Bell Witch opposed their relationship to the point of driving Betsy to reconsider the relationship and eventually break up with him at this spring, the witch also urged Richard Powell, who was much older than her, to press his suit and promised that she would take him up on the offer. Betsy and Gardner broke up on Easter Monday of 1821, and not long after, Gardner wrapped up his affairs and left for Henry County, Tennessee. He remained successful there and served as a magistrate. His family included railroad magnates and senators, so it's wrong to characterize him as this poor, star-struck lover boy, as some stories tend to do. Although the last he ever saw Betsy was in 1821, he seems to have continued thinking of the family, to the point of befriending her husband, Richard Powell, and requested that the state provide them financial relief after a number of unfortunate accidents around the farm. He died in 1887 and is buried in Gardnersville, western Tennessee.
John Jr.'s land ran kind of diagonally across over to the railroad, or maybe a little further. And this was at least one. He had, I believe 16 or 18 slaves when he died in 1862. This is the only cabin that was associated with the slaves. And inside is the two-story slave cabin. It's been built all around, all made out of log originally. And this would have been the land on both sides. It belonged to John Bell Jr., something like 600-700 acres at one time. And he lived on down the road. We'll go that way in a few minutes. I don't know if he ever had this clear in here or not. There's not any huge trees in there, but pretty sure this side was. He would allow his slaves to have a garden, their own milk cow, and they would take care of that themselves, and then they would work for him whenever he needed them, I guess. They raised tobacco. And in 1848, I believe it was, he sold 20,000 pounds of tobacco to McKendridge Tobacco Company in Clarksville to be delivered in something like April or May, which blew my mind. So they hadn't even stripped it when he sold it. And at that time, my guess is with 20,000 pounds of tobacco, it was probably something like, could have been 35, 40 acres to get that much. Today, you can raise on an acre 3,000 to 5,000 acres of pounds rather. Back then, 400 or 500 an acre would have been good. So you'd had to multiply 20,000 pounds by whatever it takes. So it'd been 30 or 40 acres tobacco. So he had to have a lot of labor. And again, he would get as high as 19 or 20 slaves. Then some of them would die. And I think when he died, he still had 16 or 17. He'd given his oldest daughter 2. And when she got married, and maybe some of the other children, but then I looked at his records and 1 or 2 had died. So just like everybody else, the slaves did die, sometimes from old age, sometimes disease. But what surprised me, I've got some of his doctor bills. He had some babies born to slaves that he had the doctor involved. Dr. Scott was brought in from Cedar Hill to deliver slave babies. He paid $6 to have them delivered. We don't think about that. We thought they were so mistreated. Well, they were taken care of because that's money, And I'm trying to think what he had paid for a slave, and my mind's gone. I want to say by the 1860, slaves, especially a young male, could go as high as $1,800. That's an awful lot of money. Lucy, when John died, they estimated her value at, I believe, $100 because she was up in her 60s. But then maybe her son, anyway, whatever his name was, my brain's dead. I think he was valued at about $500. The problem they had, he had 11 slaves, he had 8 living children and a wife. So the problem you've got, how do you divide them up? You can't really, not equally, because if Joe got a 18 or 20-year-old young man worth 18, well, whatever it was back then, $700-800, and then his sister got a female slave that was 60 years old, the values were so different. So he had to give them money or whatever to make it balance out. And Junior had some kind of a deal too, but at the time they settled his estate, slavery was over. But his value from 1860 to, of course he died in 62, to 1870 when they kind of settled the estate, really went down by 10 or 15,000 just because the slaves had been freed.
The farm on display behind the old school building on Highway 41 is often said to be the Bell family home, but in reality it is just a pioneer structure built in 1810 that was on the Bells' property. It's probably the last surviving structure on their property, and, there's some legends revolving around it, but it was more of an out structure than a home. But still to this day, a lot of people kind of tend to tell this story as if it happened in this cabin right here. And it would have been built, let me see a little bit more information because I'm reading on it now. It was on their plantation, and there's really just not much to do with the whole story. It was along the old Red River, and like many other structures in this part of the South, people would bring it from the wooded area and refurbish it and set it up and finally bring it back to the schoolhouse. And I think the schoolhouse is a cool story because it was kind of deeded to the community and has been upkept by them. And just down the road from the old schoolhouse is the Bell Witch Cave. Understand this cave hasn't really been open for several years because of COVID, and on top of that, apparently the owner kind of put in a bunch of fake gravestones and really tried to turn it into a tourist trap. Here you see a box grave that is kind of typical of the Native Americans.
Stone box burials, especially close to the river, but even up in here on some of the hills, they're almost hidden in disguise, and erosion sometimes will take it down a foot or two, and then you'll hit it with one of these rippers and knock a lid off, or even a plow if it washes away enough. They're usually pretty deep, and you can imagine using stone tools to dig a grave. I don't know how they did it. And then you carry those big slabs of limestone. Sometimes there's one across the bottom and maybe 2 on the sides or 3, and then the short ones on the end, and then they have a big slab on top of it, usually slanted one way or the other, I guess to keep the water from going directly in. But yeah, they're still here, and they found them all along the Red River, and because that was like I-24. Red River, you know, today we think about the road system. Back then they traveled the streams. Sometimes they used canoes, sometimes they walked them. And every little creek just about has some kind of village site somewhere up in here. If you see a tributary of Red River, you're going to find a campsite or a village site. And the later ones made pottery. I have a few pieces of broken pottery that came off near the Red River. And you'll find mostly arrowheads among the Mississippians. That's the last culture. The early ones had all kinds of spears and lance heads and you name it. But yeah, this was very important to the Indians. I'm surprised I can't see a piece of flint right here, and I haven't looked real hard. Do you have any luck?
Yeah, I found them.
Well, they're back there, but the one I'm talking about is right up in here somewhere laying down. It's probably about that deep under the who knows.
I believe you mentioned that Lucy Bell was half Indian?
I think Lucy's mother was. Her name was Mary, and it was a weird name. I can't remember the middle name. And just from the name, there's no pictures of her, obviously. Her husband was John Williams, and she was Mary. I don't know what her maiden name was, but from the description, I'm pretty sure she was part Indian.
Just one of the tribes along the Red River?
So I think Lucy could have been a fourth, maybe. Some kind of Indian. I don't know. I can't prove that. But when they didn't keep good records back then, they weren't real proud of it if they were part Indian. Now we want to be. All of us want to see if we're connected. I want to, I've been told I am. And when I did DNA, it said I wasn't. But the Indians don't do DNA. So you could be part Indian and never find it because it's, if they don't do DNA, it's not going to show up.
And they said that there was a burial mound near to the Bell farm.
That was over on John Senior's, and it was down close to the river. Junior owned, I guess a half a mile down there, all the way back across 41, and it kind of angled out toward Cedar Hill. And this was a part of the field here that we were trying to buy. It was right in here between here and the cemetery, and we didn't buy it. But we had a meeting about it, and that night, after they decided it was going to cost too much, the guys that owned this said, we've got 2 or 3 tombstones in our barn in Sadlersville, and we don't know who they are. And I said, man, I want to see those. So we got in the truck that night, and we had a big old light, and we dug the red clay off of it, and it was Richard Williams Bell from John Bell Senior Cemetery. They had carried it out to Sadlersville where the Covingtons lived, and they rebacked it with a piece of granite, and it was heavy, and they couldn't probably pick it back up. It took 3 of us to get one end of it up, and they just left it in there.
Yeah.
So now we got Richard's stone back. I carried it in my truck for 2 or 3 years, and I finally told Bob Bell, I said, Bob, I got to get that thing out of my truck. And so we took it to Cedar Hill and put it on the Bell farm with the others that are supposed to be put back over here. But in the meantime, I get a call from a lady in Nashville, or Goodlettsville, and she said, Bob Bell called me. He said, I just got a call from a lady in Goodlettsville, and she was fixing a house over there, and they had stepping stones. And when she flipped over one of the stepping stones, it had Mary Ellen Bell Koch. And so she called the cave, and the caveman said, I'll give her $100,000, and she didn't want to sell it. But he mentioned in the meantime Bob Bell at Austin and Bell, so she calls him, and the next morning she carried it up there, and Bob said, I'm busy, I want you to meet her. And I did, and she had that stone in 2 pieces up against the side of her truck. And she was crying, and I said, what's the matter? She said, well, I lost a grandbaby 2 years ago, and I was just thinking if somebody stole that baby's stone. And she said, I'm so upset. She said, I didn't sleep a bit last night. Every time I go to bed, I come back, the television was on, the lights were back on. And she said, I don't know what's happening. And I said, well, if I was really into the Bell Witch like a lot of people, I'd say that's what it was. But anyway, I got that stone, put it in my truck, and it and Richards rode with me for almost 2 years, 3 years. And I finally said, I got to get those out of there. I can't hardly use my truck. So Bob took them at the funeral home, and then we moved them out here to the farm. This is the cemetery where Frank Porter, is buried. Frank, supposedly, according to the book and the legend, tried to burn the Bell Witch, and there's a picture of him illustrated carrying a blanket. It looks like a person in it, and he throws it in the fire, but obviously it didn't burn the Bell Witch up. But he died in the 1870s, and he's buried up here somewhere about that dead tree out there. There's several Porters buried in there.
And you said when you found his grave, you went to take a photo of it.
Oh, have mercy. You know, I just got the courage up, and I drove, I don't know if I was in my car or truck, whatever. I drove up here and just had found it. And I had my camera with me, which I always carried it. And I got up over the top of the grave, and it died just like somebody shot it. The battery just went dead. I could not even get a flash. I drove all the way to Clarksville, which is 15, 16 miles away, to get a new battery for it because it's got weird batteries. Came back, took a picture of it the same day because I didn't want to lose it and forget it. But it's an important cemetery to me, and it's laid backwards. But you can read his details, and I couldn't find his wife. I'm sure she's buried beside him, but he was a friend of John Bell and the Bell boys.
The Porter family lived right next door to the Bells, and you can actually reach their cemetery by following the creek, which is a tributary of the Red River, right up past the spring where Betsy Bell dumped Joshua Garner, and then up to their cemetery. And this was one of the families that was famously sent on one of those wild goose chases. In this incident, the Bell Witch claimed that she was the spirit of an Indian that the Bell family had disturbed by digging up a burial mound. One of the Porters, Bennett Porter, then accompanied Drew Bell to a search for buried treasure near this mound, which the witch assured them was there, buried underneath a slab. They found nothing, but the witch supposedly taunted them the whole time and found their digging very amusing.
And these rocks are from that Porter family cemetery.